Tender Strands by Martin Dempsey. Chapter 24. Modern. When Clark entered the interview room, the internal investigation officer was already set up at the table, recorder ready, a red binder in front of him, a bottle of water lined up neatly beside a ballpoint pen and lined paper. His face was either nondescript, or the stress he was under seemed to blur out his features. One detail did impress itself upon her. His tie was a bright strip of red down the front of his body, and matched perfectly with the fabric of the ergonomic chairs of the room. Her trade union representative followed close behind her, and swiftly took a seat at a table to the side of the room, his back to the interview table. She was the only person in the room dressed casually, as due to the investigation, she was on working leave and had been called in on short notice, possibly to catch her off guard, her anxiety whispered to her. Sitting down opposite the red, grey, and human-shaped blur, she attempted to review what her union representative had told her. Stick to the facts. Don't get dragged into long explanations. Talk about people using their first names. If a phrase is repeated with an invitation to elaborate, not to be fooled, and to restate what she'd said, and to not attempt to defend herself, to not describe her emotional state at any time, and to never admit to any shortcomings. She mentally noted that one often remembers what one is doing or saying, but hardly ever what one is thinking, and she would remember thinking that, at that precise moment, for the rest of her life. The time is 5 minutes past 12 midday, and I'm interviewing Miss Clark. If you're ready, we'll get straight to the questions, if that's okay. So, how do you think the encounter at the taxicab shop owned by Mr. Cavill went? Clark took a beat, and out of the corner of her eye she noticed her union rep's shoulders had tensed. She recalled that he had mentioned he might be able to gauge how bad the situation was, if they were gunning for her, or if this was going to be a tick-box investigation by how aggressive they were out the gate. An open-ended question like the one she'd been hit with was an opening salvo, seemed to her that in that moment like a garden path laid out before her, with many branches leading off into the thick, foreboding foliage. How do you mean? As soon as the words had finished leaving her mouth, she heard a union representative let out a sigh of relief. Maybe he felt the same way about clients he was representing as the interviews they sat in, that you can gauge how they would do by their first few responses. The blur with human elements opened the file and turned to a pre-marked spot in the pile of plastic-coated pages. Your report states that you were accompanied by or accompanying Agent Smith, and that you were attending to question Mr. Cavill about the use of cabs registered in his cab firm by a chain of victims of suspicious deaths as part of an ongoing investigation. Is that right? That matches my understanding of the investigation up to that point. Your understanding of the investigation? Yes. What do you mean by your understanding? That's how I understood the reason for our visit. Clark didn't know what to do with her hands, so she moved them from her lap to under her thighs. In her shoes, she felt her toes working, clenching, forming fists and flexing. You and Mr. Smith decided to visit the establishment in the evening. Did you call ahead to see if Mr. Cavill would be there? I don't believe so, no. You don't believe so? I don't recall calling the cab firm, and I don't believe Smith did either. The interviewer led forwards. You just assumed Mr. Cavill would be there? I don't know if we assumed Mr. Cavill in particular would be there, but we knew that it was late, and it was a late opening taxi-cab garage. I see. There was no particular plan to attempt to meet Mr. Cavill in person? Was that just the luck of the draw? As I recall, we did want to meet with Mr. Cavill here on the premises, and we believed he may have access to information regarding the numbering of the cabs, their timetables and so on, that a little less senior members of staff might not have. So you turned up late on purpose. We left as soon as we noticed that several of the victims of the deaths we were investigating had all used cabs from that firm, and had performed a precursor investigation to the residence, and then Mr. Cavill himself as a result of that. Regarding Mr. Cavill, did you or Agent Smith consider him dangerous? Clark hesitated, and tried to mask her hesitation by taking a sip of water. She noticed the representative's shoulders hunched up again. She took her time swallowing, and fixing the cap back on the bottle. We were aware that he was potentially linked to several unexplained deaths, but we were also aware he had no criminal priors. Her representative's shoulders relaxed. Let's move forward in the timeline. Smith and Cavill moved into the office and you waited in the garage shop, is that right? The investigator reached for his pen and pressed the base to reveal the nib with a clean, crisp clack. Clark reached for the water bottle again, opened it, took another sip, replaced the lid, and set it down, trying to match the bottle's base perfectly with the square of condensed droplets which had formed on the tabletop. Her head swam, and unbidden memories slowly crawled forth from her subconscious, taking swift, yet careful, almost tentative, steps along her synapses. Clark attempted to stand, but her heels slipped against the greasy metal of the elevator platform, and her knees were impeded by the fabric of her skirt. For the first time she realized the hole in the repair pit she was leaving billowed plumes of sickly vapor, accounting for the pungent earthy smell she'd been engulfed in during her entire time in the bowels of the building. One of the figures started to rush towards her. It was Smith. He was shouting something at the other figure to stay where you are, don't move, and then something at her. Clark, are you all right? Can you hear me? And she tried to speak, but her face was numb. Then something following Smith, moving faster than she could make out, collided with him, and Smith screamed and seemed to vanish. Clark's feet found purchase, and she managed to crawl over to where the metal met the concrete. The muted colours of the garage seemed unnaturally bright, and although the platform she was on had stopped moving, her body seemed to react as if it were rocking. Cavill's slim outline was a collection of dark lines against the glowing slate of the surfaces that seemed to swirl around him. Somewhere, a muffled yelling seemed to be going on, somewhere above her, and something seemed to scamper out of the office door behind Cavill in a flash of iridescent turquoise and purple. Cavill seemed to be talking, and as she took a deep breath in an attempt to fill her lungs with air which smells of gasoline, cement, and air conditioning, anything other than that foul vapour, her eyes began to regain some focus, and the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears lessened, and Cavill's sounds took shape into words. I know what it is to be compelled, not because you wish, and not because you're told, to be locked on a path by another's trust, not because it's right, but because you must. When you're everything to something, their one and only, and to bear that burden, I was utterly irresponsible, and at the same time totally helpless. There was a point, I'm sure, when I could have stopped it, but I mattered for the very first time, not just to me, to something else. That mattering in itself somehow became more important than I. My world stopped being about me. It became about us. There was a whoomp noise behind him, and he stumbled forwards, his fin thame bowing backwards and arching forward as if struck hard from behind, and he almost fell to his knees. As he regained his balance and stood up straight, his movements and posture synchronized with hers. As they both retained their balance and stood upright, their eyes met. His face had an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between sorrow or remorse, and grim determination. Then, arching over his shoulder, a thick, black and brown mottled limb with a forking, wickedly hooked paw met his chest, followed by a second landing on his other shoulder, the fabric pulling and stretching under the weight, then one landing on the top of his head, another on his forearm, then a flat-topped oval head with a canine-like snout rose up behind Cavill's own, with a strip of 2 rows of wide, staring eyes down its centre, and a long, bright pink lolling tongue, panting and lapping over black and white hooked teeth. The pen clacked again. Your report says that you immediately felt sick upon entering, and that's why you hung back, to use your words, and waited in the body of the garage while Smith went to interview Mr. Cavill. Tell me, in your own words now, please, why did you feel sick? At the time, I believed it was the fumes from the petrol and the exhaust in the shop. In retrospect, I believe it was a result of the vapour machines that Mr. Cavill had set up in his office and under the garage, emitting large quantities of tannis and lao infused vapour. So you felt it was the fumes and the petrol and the exhaust stop. That's why your report says, almost word for word. If that's so, why did you choose to stay in the garage rather than accompany Smith and Cavill into the back room, where presumably the air would be cleaner? Clark reached for the water bottle again, picked it up and held it. Agent Smith and I had already discussed the interview approach that he would feel to be most effective, which would be to maintain an informal air. It was also discussed that I could make an essay of the garage to gain a better understanding of the shop. Which is it, Miss Clark? You stayed to look at the garage, or you stayed because you felt sick? It was both. We discussed the possibility of his talking to Cavill alone, and when I felt sick, we exchanged non-verbal communication confirming that I would stay in the garage. The pen nib clacked out, clacked in, clacked out. Are you aware of what tannins and loud smell like, Miss Clark? I am now, yes. At the time I believed I was, but I had not encountered it in vapour form. I don't recall smelling it immediately within the premises. I didn't become aware of the odour until... Until? The pen clacked. Until later. Let's talk about the fire. Clack. Clark froze instinctively. The thing on Cavill's back flexed its knees up and down, and continued to rise up and over him. Clark pulled her eyes from the abomination, and looked again into Cavill's eyes. They were filling with tears. Cavill stood almost motionless, apart from slowly raising his hand. Achingly slowly he reached up, past his own head height, and level with the creature's own. It animatedly bobbed up and down, panting, and never taking its many eyes off Clark. It loudly sniffed Cavill's hand, then licked it, its long tongue curling around his fingers. Clark looked back into Cavill's face, and looking directly into her eyes, he silently mouthed the word, "Run!" Clark spun on her heel and started to sprint as hard as she could towards the garage customer entrance. Behind her, she heard a barking whoop, followed by a soft thud and the sound of many scrabbling, sharp-toed paws on concrete. As she threw herself from one foot to the next, somewhere in the back of her mind she tried to calculate if she'd reached the door she'd entered into the garage before it reached her. Judging by how near it seemed to have come in the time it took her to take 3 steps, she didn't fancy her odds. As she slammed her foot into the floor to take her 4th springing step, a gunshot rang out. As she slammed her foot into the floor to take her 5th, she turned her head slightly in the direction of the echoing boom. She made out Smith, hanging impossibly upside down from greasy-looking white cord, spinning like an upside-down whirling dervish, his arms outstretched and both hands clasped around his firearm. Below him, a black entanglement of bristles, spines and spikes clustered around a bulging thorax with a blood-red splash down its center, hissed up at him with the face of a nightmarish, snarling geisha. A loud whoomp in front of her prompted her too late to turn back to look where she was sprinting. The thick-legged brown and black thing with the almost comically long tongue had landed on the door she was hoping to barge through, and was staring at her fixedly, a look of insane excitement and fixation in its multiple pairs of eyes. Clark locked her leg straight, hard, causing a bolt of pain to rack her knee, but allowing her to skid and slide like a baseball player to prevent from running face first into it, while she slammed her palms into the floor to hold her slipping directly under it. As soon as she had her purchase, she started to kick and scramble with her heels to crab walk backwards. The thing lapped its mouth and panted, eyes still fixed on her, and it bunched the flat, powerfully thick legs, seemingly to prepare to spring at her. Clack. Your report states that as far as you know, the fire hadn't begun when you were still conscious, and that's your personal belief that Cavill started it. Would you like to explain why you believe Mr. Cavill would set fire to his own business simply because 2 agents attended, asked some questions about his driving staff, and then one of them passed out from what might have been a mundane cause such as low blood pressure? Clark clenched her thigh muscles, trying to keep her voice relaxed. While it doesn't seem like a very likely explanation on the face of it, in retrospect, I once learned that Cavill had large quantities of tannis and lao, both substances pending legislation, in his basement, and that he is, at the very least, in the running as a suspect in several suspicious deaths, and it's possible he was trying to hide something. Miss Clark, you're aware that Mr. Cavill's family has begun proceedings against our department seeking compensation for destruction of property and are demanding criminal charges be levelled against yourself and Agent Smith for assault against Mr. Cavill? I'm aware they were threatening something of the kind. A letter of notice was delivered by their lawyer to the head of your department this morning, Miss Clark. Mr. Cavill is currently in a coma. His business has been set ablaze, and it is past repair. There is no evidence that he was directly involved in the deaths that you and Agent Smith insist are suspicious, but which may simply have been deaths due to natural causes or prescribed medication abuse. You need to give this investigation something more to shore up your story. Your report claims you blacked out, and you came to not knowing what happened outside the garage, which is already on fire, having been carried out by Agent Smith. It doesn't stack up. Excuse me, may I interject, please? Clark's union rep had half turned in his seat. With respect, your aim is to clarify Mrs. Clark's statement, not demand that she make a new one. Her account is perfectly clear, and it is supported by the facts. Mr. Cavill is yet to provide an account which contradicts either Mrs. Clark nor Agent Smith, and the arson investigation report has been inconclusive, but it does conclude that it's highly likely that the fire was caused by several vaporizers underneath the building being left to overheat or falling over. Unless you're suggesting Miss Smith or Agent Cavill was somehow responsible for sneaking into the basement prior to the interview and setting them up at least several hours ahead of their meeting. Clack, clack, clack. The ballpoint pen nib extended and retracted. Miss Clark, the blurring office of appropriate tire said. Why did Agent Smith discharge his firearm? Clark scrabbled backwards, her heels flailing to gain purchase, her palms scraping against rough concrete, leaving slivers of skin, her tights tearing and her skirt becoming pulled down behind her. The creature bunched its legs and lapped its tongue again and vanished. Clark winced, bracing for impact, still propelling herself backwards, but the collision she'd been expecting didn't come. Clark opened her eyes again, still scrabbling backwards, and turned her head left and right, scanning for it. Nothing. Where was it? Clark kept moving backwards, scanning now behind the front desk, and another shot rang out. Clark slowed her desperate movements backwards and tried to catch her breath. The ball of her palm met the plastic-coated box switch which had controlled and was attached to the pit elevator by a thick rubber-coated wire, and she felt the switch clack down, and she realized she was now almost level with the black and yellow painted metal plate again, which started to move downwards. Another gunshot rang out, and she turned her head to look in its direction. Smith was still hanging from his ankle, but had stopped spinning as quickly, and had levelled himself up to hold onto the rope-like thing which was supporting him with one hand. His other, his gun hand, tracking and attempting to take aim at the jagged pile of hissing and spitting legs and black and red which was rearing up and scuttling left and right below him. Clark attempted to get her feet under her and to stand, and glanced upwards. Directly above her, on the high ceiling, already bunching to pounce, was the hideous brown and black thing which had been stalking her. She flattened back down and rolled as fast as she could to her left, away from the pit. It had landed next to her with a whoomph, and she kicked at it as hard as she could. Something happened with its lower jaw as she did so. It seemed to separate and extend outwards, and her heel, connected with the two halves, wrapped around her leg, and she felt a tremendous stabbing pain. The force of her kick did skirt it backwards, however, and its thorax and rear legs tipped over the edge of the pit. Clark kicked her leg, attempted to shake it off, and felt a warm and tingling sensation rush up her trapped leg. Using her other leg this time, she kicked at it, hitting it hard in the side of its snout-like lower face, aiming but missing one of its wild, glaring eyes. Behind it, two flashes of movement ran over the edge of the pit, one a greasy grey colour, the other a frosty white. The movement drew her eyes to the pit switch on the right of the creature and her trapped leg. With a scream, Clark sat up as fast as she could and slammed her flat hand down on the switch. The elevator let out a metallic groan and reversed its course, pressing with hydraulic power upwards. Suddenly the look of triumph and wild ferocity in the creature's eyes changed to panic, and the thing's legs switched from anchoring downwards to attempting to crawl up forwards. Clark bucked her hips and pushed hard, propelling her foot further down the thing's maw. It started to squeal and beat its hooked paws on the concrete as the plate connected with it and began to crush the thing's thorax. As the creature was cut in half, Clark saw the life in its eyes leave, and she immediately attempted to pull her foot free. Then she realized the creature's fangs were embedded several centimeters into her calf. The floor seemed to buck, and a wave of nausea and fatigue overtook her. Miss Clark, would you like me to repeat the question? Why did Agent Smith discharge his firearm? The union representative's voice sounded out his interjection, his words clear and precise. As far as we're currently aware, Agent Smith's firearm has yet to be recovered. His report states that it is missing, and he believes he lost it in the scramble to get his unconscious partner, Miss Clark, and the unconscious suspect, Mr. Cabell, out of the building before it was consumed with fire. This is a deliberate attempt to encourage Miss Clark to speculate about a purely hypothetical conspiracy theory put forward by the relatives of Mr. Cabell, and it is not the role of the Internal Standards Department to advocate for them. Clark tried to let her breath out slowly, to not show that she'd been holding it. Miss Clark, your report continues, stating that while Mr. Cabell and Agent Smith were in the office, you noticed white vapour or smoke starting to billow out from the gaps around the mechanical pit. Why didn't you attempt to raise the alarm? I don't recall. I appreciate that might be a frustrating answer, but I don't. Noticing the white clouds I described was the last thing I remember. I suspect I must have tried to raise some kind of alarm, and in doing so I slipped and fell, or that I tripped over the metal plate of the pit elevator, which would explain the injuries to my ankle. But I just don't remember. The pen clacked. Tell me, please, in your own words, your first recollection after your period of unconsciousness. Clark gave up on the fangs for a moment and sat up straighter to check on the thing's rear. It had its thorax completely severed and crushed, its rear legs twisted to even more unnatural angles, and blood and ichor had sprayed across the garage and were now leaking into a pool around it. Internal organs were spilling out, including something which looked like a deflated human-sized and shaped lung. A gunshot sounded again, and Clark snapped her head up. Whatever had been playing out between Smith and the geisha creature appeared to have reached a conclusion. Smith was still suspended by the ankle, and the creature which had been attacking him seemed to have been rearing up to climb up to him, as two of its forepaws were hooked into the front of his chest, surrounded by red, expanding stains of Smith's blood, but the thing was now hanging totally limp from him. The back of its head, a red exposed crimson crater, its lower jaw parted and hanging limp. Smith groaned and tugged at the forked black paws. If they were like the thing in front of her, it would be barbed and difficult to remove. Clark fish-hooked the dead thing's upper jaw with three of her fingers and tilted her head back and wiggled her foot, freeing it from her shoe. That allowed her the space to pull her foot from the creature's throat, and from there she could unhook the fangs from her calf. As she did so, she was surprised by how little pain she felt, and then she realized her entire leg was numb. Two wells of thick, nearly black blood rose to fill the holes made vacant in the black and purple fangs flopped to its sides. Clark's head swam again, and black shadows crowded her vision and threatened to black everything out. Clark! Smith's voice helped pull her back. Yeah, I'm going to try and get free. Do you have eyes on the suspect? No. Smith swore and started hitting the cord thing with the butt of his firearm, which emitted a loud thwang, and which caused him to start spinning again. Clark once again tried to stand, but her numb leg couldn't take any weight at all. Her own blood was starting to mingle with the creature's, and despite her woozy, swimming mind and the warm, fuzzy feeling overtaking her body, she knew that wasn't a good thing. Clark pulled on one of the torn and oil-stained sleeves, ripping it free on the third hard yank, and started trying to tie it around her ankle. Her fingers weren't working properly, though, and the fabric wasn't soaking up the blood, instead becoming slippery. A pair of hands closed over hers. Keep pressure on it, Cavell said. Clark looked up into his large brown eyes. Both hands, he added. A quick succession of thwangs ran out again, followed by a gunshot, and behind Cavell's head, Clark saw Smith suddenly drop and smack into the floor, back first from several feet in the air, emitting a loud, windy groan when he did, and lay still. Clark looked down at her ankle and saw that Cavell was plugging the two holes with cotton buds and then wrapping it quickly with speed in a bandage. He pulled it tight, fixed it with a double knot, then wrapped and fixed a length of rubber tubing, which seemed to be a bit of an inner tube tire, around the top of the bandage. Try to keep your eyes open, he said. I'm going to call an ambulance. Thank you, Clark tried to say, but her tongue felt thick and lazy in her mouth. The first thing I remember was coming to being held by Smith. He had put his jacket around me and was sitting with me on the curb opposite the garage, which was in flames. I remember red and blue flashing lights and lots of commotion. I don't recall where Cavill was at that time, and I don't recall being able to see him. The pen clacked. Kneeling in front of her, Clark watched Cavill finish tending to her ankle and reach down and stroke the head of the thing which had attacked her. One by one, he used his fingers to close the lids of the creature's eyes that had them, his jaw clenching and unclenching. His chest rose and fell, and he let out a rattling, sobbing exhilaration. Clark attempted to get her mouth around the phrase, "Can you please also check on my partner?" What she managed was mostly a gurgle, accompanied by a thin, lisping lilt which she didn't recognize. Clark didn't look up. "Give me a moment. We can go in a minute. This one is nearly out, and the other one looks like he's out cold." Clark realized she'd failed to enunciate. Even in her own head, her voice sounded like so she tried again. "Just give me some time." Clark tried to say please, but again, her own voice sounded foreign to her, more like a breathy Marilyn Monroe impersonation that went on longer than what she was trying to say. First Judy, now Wincy, and Sooty. We've got to be more careful. Much more careful. I've got some cash in the register, enough to get us out of town. We can take a cab, then ditch it somewhere. Clark took a breath and tried again to say, "Please check on my partner." "Okay, let me get ready." Clark tried to say, "Please," again, but then she remembered something urgent. There were still things in the basement, at least two of them. They must flee, now. "We have to go," she tried to say, but her face was going numb. The lisping noise was closer now, more cawing and insistent, and the darkness was closing around her vision, reducing the world to two small tunnels of blurry colour and motion. The numbness and fuzziness seemed to take shape in a pool in the centre of her forehead, and for a second she seemed to lose her vision completely until the blue spot of colour moved downwards. Another pool of pressure without feeling pressed on her chest, another on her forearm, another on her clavicle. Something was walking down her body. She tried to sit up again. She hadn't realized she'd fallen back, but all she could do was lift her head off the floor and look down at her own body. Cavill was still there, kneeling either side of her leg, but she was viewing him through the gap between her chest and the undercarriage of something, covered in blue and turquoise-coloured feathery hair, standing on her. The tips of several of the feathers, like fronds, brushed her face and irritated her lips. A shape joined Cavill to the left, and immediately after another to his right. One was a ball of thick, tousled, frosty white hair with the apparent texture and light refraction of fiberglass. The other was a slick, oily, leathery oval of skin and bristles. Clark heard the lispy, breathy voice again, and she realized it was someone else speaking. "Now, Arthur, it's us who have to go. We were waiting for Sooty and Wincy to collapse the waveform of causality. Generating observer of significant amplitude, but now we have no reason to stay. We are going to go back to Mother." Clark visibly flinched at the word Mother. Suddenly, in an instant, the two shapes either side of Cavill darted forwards, and a hideous slurping and crunching began, punctuating with sighs and purring noises. Cavill made a noise which may have been a swear word, and pushed himself away, turning his head and lifting his glasses to wipe his eyes. The blue creature pattered up to him and put its two front legs up to him, as if in a display or asking to be lifted. Cavill glanced down at it, his eyes still wet with tears, visibly distressed. It tentatively stepped towards and stroked his shin with a forked paw, then scuttled up his body with flinch-inducing speed to hang from his chest. Cavill's arms drew in to support it, and as if by habit, his fingers started to ruffle its back hair. The slurping at her feet stopped, and the two shapes scampered over to Cavill's feet and extended their paws to touch his shins. "Put your hands up," Smith's voice, thick and slurry, rang out. Cavill didn't move. "Put your hands up and stand away from my partner, now!" Cavill started to sit up again. Clark tried to move with him, but her arms wouldn't support her. "Don't make me shoot you. You must show me your hands and turn around now, or you will be shot. This is your last warning." Something on the blue thing's back lifted up, iridescent and patterned like a peacock's tail, the light shining and shimmering off it. Then the pattern on it seemed to shift. A whirl of dizziness took over Clark again, and sparks seemed to join the light worms and blotches of colour swimming before her eyes. For a moment, the smell of blood and oil and viscera seemed to take on the quality of sea air, then damp, wet stone, and the two creatures at Cavill's feet lifted off the floor, running up his legs, and seemed to run, somehow, into the extended feathers on the blue thing's back, and vanished. A gunshot rang out. "That was a warning shot. I will not ask again. Turn around with your arms in the air, now." "Don't leave me," Cavill whispered. The thing at his chest raised its head to look up at him. Then its face split in two at the jaw, and two wickedly sharp needles slammed into his left upper forearm. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Cavill screamed and spread his arms out wide in shock and pain. At the same time, the creature's back feathers dropped down, and it seemed to wipe itself out of existence. Cavill then staggered backwards, placing a heel on the elevator switch, which skidded from under him, triggering the metal plate behind him to start to lower, and as he fell backwards, Clark lost consciousness. As everything went black, she saw Smith walking towards her on the opposite side of the slowly deepening hole, as plumes of vapor, rich and pungent, gushed upwards, surrounding Smith. As Clark's eyelids lowered, he became a silhouette against the white cloud, which was then slowly replaced with total darkness.